We're now moving on to the one of the climaxes of the day, I think, where we look beyond the pilots and the existing R&D projects to look at least beyond the next 3 to 5 years into the future. We want to hear from our panelists a little bit about the way we're going to be producing and consuming culture in the mid to long term. And we want to think a little bit about what kind of new skills and resources arts bodies are going to have to cultivate in order to respond to that opportunity. So I'm delighted to say that we have with us Paula Dieu from the Mozilla Foundation. That's a change to our program. We have Anthony Lilley, the CEO of Magic Lantern, and we have Harger, the artistic director of Lighthouse. And I'm going to ask Anna to speak first of all. Over to you.
Thanks, Paul. And thanks to Nesta and to the Arts Council for the invitation to be amongst so many friends and colleagues, many people I admire. It's quite amazing looking around the room and seeing who's here. Also a great privilege to be on a panel with Anthony and Paula. I won't keep you too long because they're the ones that have the interesting things to say. I suppose I really wanted to start by kind of giving us some things to think about and to maybe just tell a little bit of a parable about the future. When asked what the future would look like, the Finnish mathematician and writer Hannu Rajaniemi said, "Things will appear the same unless you know how to look." And that might seem like a really trivial thing to say, but actually it embodies something quite deep and profound, which is one of the central challenges of navigating the future. And that's how on earth do we actually see it? So one of the jobs that I have at Lighthouse is to try and show that digital culture is about more than just tools and gadgets and, you know, kind of fancy things that have got flashing screens. It's really about trying to perceive the societal transformations that technology is enabling. And we care deeply and are very interested in the way the digital world is made, what it's made of, and even where it is. And it really seems to us that the more heavily encoded our world becomes, the harder it is to read. As technology has become ubiquitous, as our relationship with our digital devices has become more seamless, technical infrastructure has become kind of intangible. It's perhaps no mistake that we now refer to the vast server banks that store all of our personal data as the cloud. Cloud computing, it's somewhere in the air. And this has become a very persistent and I would say quite deceptive metaphor. And that's perhaps best borne out by the fact that there was a survey conducted last year that revealed that around 51% of Americans believe that bad weather affects cloud computing. We may well laugh, but this is a really dangerous misapprehension about what digital is. All that is solid has not melted into the air. On the contrary, digital is very much bricks and mortar. It's made of really colossal physical infrastructure, such as the data centers that Amazon and our good friends at Google are building. These are real buildings that generate, you know, kind of massive amounts of data. They're not sort of ethereal manifestations in the air. It's enabled by thousands and thousands of miles of submarine cable at the bottom of the ocean, that sort of quintessentially 19th century technology. And those cables are transporting bits of the cloud from one building to another. Not very cloud-like all of a sudden, is it? So we're absolutely, you know, kind of and unquestionably relying on this physical infrastructure for the information and communication that helps us kind of orientate our way in this world. But we're dangerously unaware of how it works. And that's because we can't see it. It's become invisible. And invisibility can be a very, very dangerous concept. As the writer China Melville says, something invisible in the landscape is just landscape. The point of invisibility is to fail. So seeing the digital world for what it is, something material, something tangible, something that we made, is the first step. But we also have to be able to describe this world. We have to be able to read it. And I think that some of the people who are best equipped to help us do that, people that we work with as part of our program at Lighthouse, are people like media artists, critical engineers, and speculative designers. They're giving us tools, tactics, and prisms to make this world that we live in more legible. But they're also going one step further. These are the people that are using the new materials of the post-digital age, synthetic biology, nanotechnology, and 3D printing. It's quite interesting to note that in the last couple of years alone, the largest media art festival in the world, that's Ars Electronica, has awarded its main prizes to artists who are making solar-powered 3D printers, an artist who's making paintings from nanotechnology, an artist that's making radio with bacteria, and an artist who's created sailing drones that clean up oil spills. These are the urgent social, political, and environmental issues of the near future. If you don't believe me, it's only this week that the European Space Agency have announced plans to team up with Norman Foster to 3D print the next lunar module. They're planning on 3D printing a moon base made of moon dust. So that's going to be the material they're using to 3D print the building. Now, if you're not looking carefully at this space, it can be very much as Ray Anami has said, the world appears just as it is right now. But there are transformations which are ripping through everything from medicine to health to manufacturing to logistics. And it's our job as a sector to really take Ray Anami's words to heart and to really learn how to look.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you. Over to you, Anthony.
Wow, thank you, Anna. I have the great honour of, if that's not too much, following my friend on my left in speeches quite often. I chair Lighthouse, in the interest of full disclosure. And Anna speaks well, I speak at best in prose compared to Anna, but I do try and do some jokes. Look, I think if there's any prediction I'd like to make, it's that we will eventually stop using this damn word digital. There's been a sort of hint of sedition about the room this afternoon. There usually is when Matt Adams is present, and that's a good thing. It's not the digital that's interesting anymore, if it ever was. Also in the interest of full disclosure, Paula and I spent a few years working together at Magic Lantern. It was the digital then. It was the kind of magical new thing that you were talking to people about. But I think if anything, what we need now is a more practical, pragmatic grounding in the fact that this is just a part of life now. Somebody was talking earlier about we don't have a pens policy at the Arts Council. We don't do R&D around paper, and that's the easy way to describe it. I think that's true, but actually it masks something slightly deeper, which is that these debates are very fond of what I think are mostly false dichotomies: the digital, the real. I don't know that that's a valid distinction. Are you being digital with a cell phone or a tablet in your hand as you walk down the street, engaging with social networks, on a bus, in a real place? It's a meaningless construction increasingly. And there's a lot of work now starting to sort of respond to the notion that that is a false notion. I've heard at tables this afternoon another one. There's art and there's marketing. Well, there's art and there's marketing if you don't believe art wants to be found. Because to some degree, great art is its own marketing. That's part of its point. I've never met or worked with a great artist who would really like nobody to find out. So within great creative work, great art, of course there is marketing. The false dichotomy, it comes out a lot in the social media session. You know, is there participation or is there marketing? I don't think it's a valid dichotomy in any way. And I found myself for the last year or so working in both spaces. We're just literally now, I think, or later this evening, publishing a piece of work I've been doing for the Arts Council and Nesta on big data. I think what I've been looking at is, can we realistically as a cultural sector start to be very honest about how good we are at utilising data? And the answer is mostly pretty awful. Before we get excited by the kind of, or not before, alongside getting excited by the novelty and the kind of internet centricity and being all utopian about new technology, which institutions, which organisations in the room would be honestly able to say that they'd find themselves in what I describe as the third generation of data in that paper? The first is, what you've got is a lot of data inside systems about what you do in the, quotes, real world. Box office data, databases, stuff like that. So that's data 1.0. Data 2.0 is really terrifying, and it's where most people are now, which is that you're being hosed with new kinds of data from analytics and websites and social networks and Facebook likes and, you know, Uncle Tom Cobley and all, and that has no relationship to the other data you've got at all about your organization. And the kind of nirvana is, can we move towards a situation where you can bring those two things together so you know more about the art you make and the people you make it for and with into a sort of third generation? That to me is a much more urgent challenge than shall we have some apps, because it falls to the resilience of the cultural sector. It falls to debates about funding, it comes to debates about how you should allocate resources, and it involves some people taking some leadership. And a big piece of quite academic research being published later on that I did for the guys with a collaborator called Professor Paul Moore. At the other extreme, I've been working with, very lucky to work with, Josie Rourke at the Donmar Warehouse, and a very splendid writer, who I can't tell you about yet because we've not gone public, to look at a piece, a genuine theatre, multi-platform type theatre piece about what it means to live in a digital age. And to do that, we're researching with actual people. We're not reading the books. We're also reading the books. But we're actually looking at real behaviours. Because I think, if anything, this awful quote that goes around that the future's already here to some degree in the behaviour of some people, the truth is it's now in the behaviour of pretty much most people, in the interesting dimensions, the social, cultural change dimensions, etc. And for me, if you want a more sort of trenchant proof of that, it's the kind of hand-wringing debates we've heard over Christmas about the death of the high street, as if nobody could have seen it coming. As if the fact that we're all secretly buying everything from Amazon, but we really expected everybody to still be able to carry on working on the high street is a surprise in some amazing way. It's another sort of false dichotomy. It's sort of slightly fitting to be here. Earlier on in the day, I sort of had this slight daydream of Dumbledore, 'cause it's a bit like Harry Potter, isn't it, Hogwarts in here, of Dumbledore at the front sort of sorting people into digital and not digital all the way through. And these false dichotomies they're masking a deeper unease. They're masking a deeper inability we have to come to terms with what it means to be living a good life in a digital age. So I'd concur with honour more than I can say that if arts and artists have a role, and they unequivocally do, it's in part to help us answer those deep questions. But in the process, we need to really get real, in the words of Culture 24's work on analytics. Get real about what we do in the digital space, our basics. Get the basics right as well as the big vision. I think that would be the vision of my last year and probably of my next 2 or 3 years.
Thank you very much, Anthony. That's great. Paula, let's finish us off.
I came to this panel very late in the day today, so if honour is the poetry and Ant is the prose, I am desperately striving for some coherent bullet points, so bear with me here as I try and string together something sensible. I thought it would be really useful to just have a little look into the future through the eyes of young people. My work with Mozilla at the moment is very focused on young people and how they operate within the connected world. And I thought that might give us some little clues as to the kinds of world that we can expect. So I think the first thing is just to reiterate, I guess, what Ant has said, which is that young people don't understand the idea of a digital world. It's one world. And they don't make this distinction increasingly. They think of the web and their devices in much the same way that we think of our memory and our sensory organs. They are things that can be called on and invoked at will. They are places where they store really important parts of their life, and they are ways through which they collect and understand the world around them. So I have literally heard a 15-year-old describe their phone as an extra sense. To take it away from them feels as if you are depriving them of a sense. And when you start to understand that context in which they are engaging with the connected world, you sort of start to appreciate just how seamless for them it feels, and that this notion of a digital sphere versus a real sphere is just nonsensical to them. I think, keeping that in mind, they really think about the web, and increasingly, although they don't articulate it like this, this is me being aspirational, they really do think of the web in particular, but every time I say web, you should really hear connected world. Just think about all of the kind of access points and connections that exist that the web facilitates. So it isn't just this thing that we may imagine as being a website. The web really is that network and how that works. I've just managed to lose my screen, and my thoughts are therefore completely also locked away from me.
Living the dream.
Indeed, I am not such a young person, but I very much empathise with their view of the world. So if we sort of think about that extra sense, then you start to understand that the web in particular is this extraordinary repository, and increasingly an incredible expression of their cultural, their civic, and indeed their entrepreneurial selves. It is the tool through which they imagine they will be able to have the greatest impact on their lives and the lives around them. So if we sort of, think very carefully about that world and extrapolate that 10 years hence, when we've got a whole generation reaching adulthood for whom that is normal, and then we add in a couple of other factors. So young people in 10 years' time will be steamed. Who knows this phrase, steamed? It's one of my favourite ones at the moment. Yep, there's a couple of hands. I note actually younger people from a PhD background, so it's interesting. So STEAMed means they will be well versed in science, technology, entrepreneurial thinking, the arts, maths, engineering, and drama. They will walk and talk the connected world. The extraordinary thing that this means is that they will make the connected world as well as consume. The bad news is that unless we are about to embark on a very serious course of study and engagement, many of us will be left behind simply as consumers of that connected world. This generation will make that connected world. And I think when we start to contextualize that within the cultural and artistic space, we understand that if indeed we get it right, and if indeed we do get a generation of extraordinary makers of the connected world, then we will have a generation that thinks very naturally through making, that they will share and collaborate in public spaces in very much the same way that we share and collaborate in a good conversation. For them, it will feel the same. I think the other things to keep in mind is this is a world that is not without problems. Privacy will be incredibly challenged. It already is. I think the next 10 years we will see an enormous change in the way that we think about and consider privacy. And I think it bodes for us to think about where privacy has come from and where it may end up. I think the other thing, of course, is where this sort of steamed education may only be available to a privileged group of people who can access a more agile education system, or indeed have the luxury of extracurriculum educational access. So I think we are very much going to see a have and have-nots of a whole new kind opening up around us. It also really poses some very interesting challenges for those of us, and most recently I was one of these. It's my great joy to be now working for Mozilla, so I get to look back in. But it really does pose some very interesting challenges for the incumbent cultural aggregators, many of which I know are here today. If you've got a collection, data, an archive, events, and they are not quotable by this generation, you will be irrelevant. If you are not part of their conversational space, You will not be part of their cultural lives. And what I mean by quotable is, can they quote your collection? Can they quote your archive? Can they draw on your data and include it as part of their conversational space? And that conversational space is visual, it's functional. And if they can't do that, you don't exist in their cultural world. I've got to really increase my length of downtime. The other thing, of course, is that if you think that you're doing a lot of navel gazing now about what is our role, what role do we have with our audiences, then the next 10 years is going to be brutal for you guys. Really brutal. Sorry, I shouldn't laugh. I'm part of it. Because if you think about a generation who can read and write the connected world, they are going to radically challenge every aspect of creative, curatorial and performative norms. And somehow you guys are going to have to find the language and the context and the frameworks to be in a constant negotiation with them about what your role as cultural curators and institutions are. And it's going to be a constant dialogue, not a one-off. This is going to be a generation and subsequent generations who demand a constant conversation. But finally, we also face, I think, the fascinating prospect of divining whole new areas of expression. And I think folks like Lighthouse and others are really at the vanguard of really thinking about how do we stop making radio for television, and how do we really think very carefully and recognise and nurture the generation that comes, and these folks will be the pioneers of truly finding the expressive power of this fantastic new medium that is the connected world.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paula. We have some provocative thoughts there about the implications of a connected world, the implications of big data, and the implications of artists working at the very frontiers of technology and science. Could I hear comments and questions, please? We'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for comments and questions, and I'll try and take them in groups. There's one here. Could you please remember to give your name and organisation? Thank you very much.
Hi, Nikki Matthews from the University of Southampton. I just want to pick up on this notion of dichotomy and false distinctions, because I think there's a real opportunity certainly within the digital R&D funding to look at the functions of each of the partners, because universities aren't just researchers, they're developers and they are practitioners. Arts organisations are researchers and technologists are researchers and artists. So I think looking at the functions of collaborations and not necessarily boxing people in particular aspects would be really useful things to look at through this fund and beyond this fund.
Thank you. That's a very useful comment. Do we have another question we can bring in to that? John.
John Pratty from the Arts Council. It was really interesting and fascinating hearing both Paula and Honor outline this new cultural space. And a follow-on thought really is, if we are to curate or create within this instantaneous opportunity, we've actually got to develop quite a different set of cultural synapses and sensitivities. It's almost like the difference between old-fashioned archives and real-time archives. It feels like we need to be creating and saving and collecting and making relationships with our culture all the time, instantaneously. And I wonder how we're actually going to learn how to do that. What would you say about that?
Okay, so we've got those two questions. One about the multifaceted nature of the partnerships that have been created in this R&D exercise. John, how would you do? Yes, and how do we manage that and learn from it in the future.
Okay, I'll have a crack at this. So I couldn't agree with you more in terms of removing artificial boundaries, I think, between expertise. And I think, you know, one of the themes that I was desperately trying to sort of thread through here is that we have to see, we have to be prepared to look for where the expertise is as opposed to making assumptions about where the expertise is. So I would certainly advocate that the R&D Fund sort of thinks very carefully about that. I think around this question of cultural change within organisations, it has been my great privilege to work in organisations that have incredible archives, the BBC and the BFI most notably. And I think, you know, one of the ways that I characterise that change is, and this is horribly simplistic, as any of you engaged in that space know, but it's making that transition from a really heartfelt commitment to protecting archives for future generations. And in both the BBC and the BFI's case, it's written into their purpose that that's what they're there to do. And I think that the change is that those future generations are now here. And I think that's the really tricky bit, is making that transition. And in both of those organisations, the heart is very much there. They are very committed to making that change. We have a great deal of institutional baggage, and I mean institutional in the very broadest sense. We have laws that really are not built for a connected world. We have institutional structures that are not built for a connected world. So there's a lot of kind of, if you like, hardware change that needs to happen, as well as cultural and social change that needs to happen. I guess to answer your question, it comes back to a comment I think that Paul made in the earlier panel, which is just don't think about your audiences as being the problem. They are your collaborators. They are the ones who will most help you understand the ways that you can adapt and deliver to their needs and their expectations. And so I think it's really be very open-minded as quickly as you can and really listen very hard and work very closely with those folks that you once considered your audience.
Anthony.
Yeah, I come at that in much the same way, but maybe with a slightly different emphasis to do with, go back to the sort of notion of false dichotomies again. There's a kind of flip side to that, which is that there are an awful lot of things around us now where seemingly opposite things turn out both to be true. So it used to be either ors, and now there are lots of boths around in the way you have to think about the world. And you know, by which I mean something like, how is it we spend an awful lot of time worrying about archives and depth of data and discoverability of data going backwards to provide the maximum possible amount of data, when at the same time you're watching Twitter to find out what's happening right now, which you'll not be interested in 90 seconds' time? Well, the answer is not because it's either or, it's because it's both. And in sort of cod scientific terms, these false dichotomies come from an illusion. They come from an illusion that society isn't complex. They come from this sort of rather sort of safe, slightly primary school version of the world where there is kind of black and white. I remember hearing, Alice, you've heard this, Paula, Alistair Campbell, of all people, say once, when they were doing votes on Sky News, interactive television votes, you know, should we have invaded Iraq, press red. Was it okay if you believe we shouldn't have done, press green if you believe we should have done? He said and he was joking obviously, they considered mandating a grey button on all television remotes marked life is more complicated than that. And you know, there is an element of truth in that requirement. Donald A. Norman, the design theorist, says you've got to get used to the fact that the universe is complex. We make it complicated. And they're not necessarily the same thing. So artists are brilliant at that. The whole point is to sort of find your place in these complexities. Institutions find it more difficult because to some degree you end up wishing you could have a nice, easy, simple strategy, but in fact very often you have to cover lots of bases.
Thank you, Anthony. Honor.
I'll just make a quick remark to John's point. The only comment I have to the University of Southampton's observation is yes. But to John's point, which is a very big question, you know, kind of how do we do this? How do we get here? I guess I just want to point to 2 practical examples, one that I've been involved with and one I haven't. On the need for creating the hardware changes that institutions need to you know, subject themselves to, we could look directly at the work of the Government Digital Service, the GDS, and how they're, you know, kind of quietly but definitively revolutionising how government interacts with its so-called users. This is really, really paradigmatically important work, and I think all institutions can learn from that. On how we change ourselves as arts organisations, I'd draw on the experience that we had at Lighthouse with Happenstance, the project that we did with Site Gallery, which Laura spoke so eloquently about, and Caper. By bringing creative technologists who are already doing this, they're already exceptionally good, agile, they are the people Paula's talking about, into your organisations, you cannot help but change yourself. It really does happen automatically just by watching the way they work, listening, and allowing yourselves to be influenced by them. In my view, I've said this several times and I really believe it, right now, having a creative technologist on your team should be as absolutely essential as having a bookmaker. That would be good, wouldn't it? A bookkeeper on your team. It's an absolutely essential, you know, kind of skill, because we cannot possibly, you know, kind of future-proof our organisations for all the possible technological changes that are on the horizon. You know, we cannot predict how 3D printing is going to change our business. We can't predict how synthetic biology is going to affect medicine. But creative technologists are looking in this space already, so bring them in. Put them on your teams.
Thank you, Anna. Actually, a bookmaker might be a better bet in the long run. Yeah.
I just make one more point.
Yeah.
One small sort of practical tip. I don't remember when this was, Paula, about 2007 or 6 or something in Magic Lantern. How many institutions in the room have a thing called a server which does your email? Turn it off. See what it does to your organisation and your understanding. We turned off Magic Lantern. We turned off £200,000 worth of servers and an IT department one Monday, and went to the cloud. And that was a little bit early, because of course we're those sorts of people. But actually when you do it, and many of you do because you have Gmail and other sorts of things, when you do it, you suddenly get it in a way you didn't before. You really do. Turn it off.
Thank you. Thank you, Anthony. We've got time for 1 or 2 more questions. One here, and name an organisation, please.
Alistair Eelbeck, Me, You and Us. And I just kind of feel slightly compelled to say, you've mentioned 2006. Turning your servers off. I had to think about the future a bit recently, and what really struck me was actually looking in the past, and actually 2006, like YouTube, Flickr, Twitter, you know, Facebook, they were kind of almost didn't exist, and I thought that's affected me quite. That's it.
And was there another one? Yes, over here, please.
Hi, my name's Claire Timon. I work part-time for Blackburn with Darwin Borough Council, and I'm also a freelance art manager. When I'm working at Blackburn, I get into work in the morning, I turn my computer on. It can take me half an hour to open Outlook. I try and open a website that an artist has sent me as part of their reference. I get access denied. I go onto YouTube to try and download a video. No chance. I think today I've come here and my expectations of the event have completely been exceeded. I've found it so interesting and I've learned a huge amount. But I think there's a separation between what's gone on in terms of your pilot case studies and what can happen in reality. When I work really hard to try and get the local authority to support creativity and, you know, ways we can deliver their objectives in a much more creative and cultural way. But we just don't have the resources to support some of the things that you've been talking about. And I think your question What future areas should public initiatives like the Digital and R&D Fund prioritise? I'd really like to see that maybe some of this can be approached in that.
Okay, well that was two very pertinent comments, one about the speed of change and the other the slowness of change in terms of the everyday experience. And I'd like to ask each of our panelists just to give us just one sentence each on this. Thank you. Can we start with you, Anna?
Really, really quick, kind of comment. Again, look at the GDS. That's exactly the issue that they are solving from within government. It doesn't cost lots of money. It's a different way of thinking. And I would absolutely encourage you to get your colleagues to look at what they're doing.
Anthony.
I hear what you're saying quite a lot, because I do a lot of work in schools, and that's scandalously an area in which there's still too much of that kind of restriction. There's only glib answers, actually, from people who don't live your everyday life. But ultimately it will change, because it has to. I think I go to a different place when I'm talking about the rate of change. I look even further back. When I'm looking for sort of indicators of what might happen next, I tend to look to what I think Stephen Johnson describes as the old growth of the internet. Places where the internet's been around a bit longer, where people have been doing things on the web longer, games, tech, various areas of content, and look for those. And then also take a really long view. I'm reading a book called 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism. One chapter in it says, the internet is much less important to the history of humanity so far than the invention of the washing machine. Because the invention of the washing machine liberated women from having to work in the home all the time. So let's keep it in proportion, shall we?
Thank you. Paula.
Yeah, to keep it very simple, I think the near past teaches us that we haven't got a clue what the near future is going to be. So I think that's probably an important thing. Around IT, my proudest and probably least sexy thing I did at the BFI while I was there was completely rip out the old IT and put new IT in, so that when they turned their computers on in the morning, they fired up straight away. They didn't crash 3 or 4 times during the day, and they had broadband in there that actually accommodated an organisation that was dealing with moving image. And it was, without question, the hardest thing that we did within the BFI. It was the least sexy, and it was probably the least lauded, because once you got it, you just take it for granted. But it is possible, and I suppose the summary here is talk to your IT folks. Tell them what you need. I know it's really hard, but just tell them what you need, because they're often as hampered as you are.
Thank you very much, Paula. Well, thank you. Can I, on your behalf, can I please thank our 3 panelists this afternoon? Thank you.